Hello, learner. Welcome to Mr. Quaker's Teachers. In this lesson, I'll be analyzing Nathaniel HAWTHORNE's short story, Dr. Heidegger's Experiments. I'll read portions of the story and explain the different figures of speech, the writer's tone, language, the themes, imagery, and other figurative devices that Hawthorne uses to strikingly present the short story. Let's dive in. Let's begin by speaking about the short story writer Hawthorne. He was born on July 4th, 1804 and died on May 19th, 1864. He was an American novelist and short story writer. In this short story, that is Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, Hawthorne tells or dramatizes the idea that a person cannot change their true nature on impulse. And he uses four characters, Mr. Medbourne, Connor Killigrew, Mr. Gascoigne, and a woman, Widow Wycherley, to present this. These four characters that I've mentioned congregate in the title character, that's Dr. Heidegger's study. And then they drink from the fountain of youth, with a promise that they are going to change their ways, but immediately their youthful, their youth returns. We see that they return to, or they sort of stick to their nature, which is their real nature, and that's one of the key things that Hawthorne dramatizes in the short story. Now, Hawthorne uses the example of four age characters. I've mentioned their names already, who have their youth miraculously restored after they consume water from the elusive and famed fountain of youth, to strikingly show that a person's habits, character traits, and mannerisms is hard to abandon. And he begins by introducing us to the title character, Dr. Heidegger. Dr. Heidegger is the protagonist of the story, an eccentric elderly medical doctor. He is the convener or host of the meeting and the dispenser of the de-aging water. The narrator's use of singular, you see that in the first sentence, that very singular man. The narrator's use of singular, i.e., remarkable in his description of Dr. Heidegger, shows that he's enthralled by him. So we see that the short story begins with an introduction of Dr. Heidegger and then his four elderly friends. Here, the narrator names the four meeting attendees. So the first character that he mentions, you can think of them as like supporting characters. In fact, the short story, the aspects of the short story that are really important are the characters and then the description of Dr. Heidegger's study. So the first character that he introduced to us is Mr. Medbourne. He's an elderly man. He was once a wealthy merchant. He became poor after he invested all his money in frantic speculation. His attitude suggests that he loves to gamble and take senseless risks. So that's the first character that we meet, Mr. Medbourne, apart from Dr. Heidegger. And the second supporting character is Connor Killigrew. Also now elderly, he wasted his best years in the pursuit of sinful pleasures. That's what Hawthorne tells us. So this revelation shows that he was a playboy or a Casanova in his youth. His debauchery, excessive engagement in sex and alcohol cost him a number of what is described as soul and body challenges. Soul and body is in quotes. So we see that there in how Hawthorne describes him. The third character that we see is Mr. Gascoigne. He was a corrupt politician in his youth. He only seemed decent to the reader because his unscrupulous actions occurred many years ago. So now he's elderly, and so people cannot remember some of the actions that he took. Then the fourth character, supporting character, is Widow Wycherley. She's the only female participant in the meeting. She's described as a great beauty in a day. So it means that in the past she was a dame, a very beautiful woman. But then we are told that she became reclusive, that is, cut herself from society after she engaged in a scandalous act with men. So it's like we have these characters that all have negative attributes tied to them. Then we also see the use of flashback as well. So the revelation of the characters is recounted with flashback. So when they talk about Mr. Medborn, Conakry, Gascoigne, and then with the Witchley, we see that flashback is used. And that's really important because it tells us that they are telling us about their past actions, the kind of life that they lived in the past. And we see that the evidence of the use of flashback is seen in the use of the past tense in the narration of the character traits of the supporting characters. All three elderly gentlemen, Mr. Medborn, Conakry, and Mr. Gascoigne, in their younger years, had all been lovers of Widow Wycherley. Then, they literally fought for her affection. The narrator provides visual imagery of this with the expression, the point of cutting each other's throats for her sake. So, all four characters were people or were lovers of Widow Wycherley. I mean, she's a widow now, which sort of tells us that she must have married and then maybe her husband died. But then at that point, she was like something like the belle of the ball, and they all loved her. We also see the use of visual imagery as well, right? The narrator uses visual imagery, and we see that when he says the point of cutting each other's throats for her sake. So it's like they were willing to sacrifice the other to get her hand, or to sort of woo her and get her to succumb to their affections, to retain their affection. Now, the next thing that we see that Hawthorne does is that he gives a very, very powerful description of Dr. Heidegger's study. And he described this as a very curious place. Very curious place. The use of curious suggests that it is a circus, like something like a circus or a place of oddities. So when I read this, for example, I remember Ripley's a show that I used to watch in the past, where you see all of these oddities that have been stored in a room. Then it's also described as dim, D-I-M, which shows that it was poorly lit. Old-fashioned chamber portrays it as having a cake architecture, while festooned with cobwebs evokes the image of a place that has been deliberately decorated with a generous amount of spider webs, while besprinkled with antique dust attributes a sense of magic and otherworldliness to the setting. So one of the key things I see as I read the short story is that there's a sense of Gothic architecture, like it's very Gothic. And then the way the characters behave and the way the entire setting is also described is, it's like sort of a mixture of, real fiction, right? Fictional reality, but then at the same time, there's also the sense of magic and, otherworldliness that is tied to the narration as well. Now, Hawthorne also describes some standard features of Dr. Heidegger's study. The first one that he mentions is the bronze bust of Hippocrates. So Hippocrates is the father of Western medicine. The fact that Dr. Heidegger held consultations in all different cases of his practice with him suggests that he was getting information from the father of medicine. So here, Hippocrates had died like long ago, but the idea that Hawthorne presents to the reader is that Dr. Heidegger can sort of have like interactions with Hippocrates. It also suggests that Dr. Heidegger had mental problems and was edgy. So if he's able to speak to somebody that is dead through their bust, there's this sense that he's like somebody that has like mental problems or is edgy. The second standard feature of Dr. Heidegger's study is a tall and narrow oaken closet. And we are told that it housed a skeleton. It is located in the obscurest corner of the room. So that's the second thing that we see. So a tall and narrow oaken closet, and then it houses a skeleton. And it's the corners, some dim. I mean, the setting is already dim, but then it's at the obscurest part of it, the farthest part of it. The third standard feature we see is the looking glass. It is rumored to contain the spirit of Dr. Heidegger's dead patient. So imagine that the looking glass houses all of Dr. Heidegger's dead patients. This detail introduces the theme of superstition to the narration. So there's this sense of superstition now in the narration. And then the fourth thing we see is a full-length portrait of a young lady. So there's also a portrait of Dr. Heidegger's dead fiancée in the study. She died the evening before their wedding after she drank a prescription medicine that she found in his house. And then the fifth is described as the greatest curiosity of the study, and is described as a ponderous folio volume. It's a titleless book. It is believed to be a book of magic. And we are told that touching it made the four other oddities come alive. And we see that when we are told that the maid tried to clean it, and immediately she did, it came alive and said, "Forbear!" Flashback. The narrator uses flashback about a century ago to give a brief backstory of Dr. Heidegger, his romantic life. The fact that his fiancée died on the bridal evening after swallowing his prescription medicine makes the reader feel sympathy for him. So we are told that she died, and then immediately after that, he never married again. We also see the use of personification as well, and so the blend of personification and superstition. The narrator personifies the skeleton by saying that it's rattled. And we're also told that the picture of the young lady by saying that it stepped at one foot upon the floor, and the brazen head of Hippocrates by saying that it frowned and said, "Forbear!" All in response to the maid lifting the book. Their hostility exposes the underlying violence in the setting, the importance of the ponderous folio, and the book of magic. It also injects superstition into the already Gothic setting. So we see this sense of, it's very important that you imagine, or in your head, you picture that the setting is very Gothic. We see the use of visual imagery as well. The quote, "brazen head of Hippocrates frowned," provides vivid visual imagery of the stern look that appeared on the bust of Hippocrates as he displayed the disdain for the cleaner's action. So we are told that, but it was well known to be the book of magic, and once when a chambermaid had lifted it merely to brush away the dust, all of these things happened. And then the brazen head frowned and said, "Forbear!" We also see the use of auditory imagery as well in the word "forbear," especially the use of the exclamation mark at the end. So "forbear" provides auditory imagery that the brazen head screamed in rebuke to the chambermaid. This might have been done to frighten the maid and make her aware that she is forbidden from touching the ponderous folio no matter the circumstance. So the reaction of the personified things also introduces superstition and the power of unseen forces. So we see here that, so this is not like just realism. It's like a story that has like superstition tied to it. So even though the characters appear to be, normal characters that can be related with, there are aspects of the story that are not entirely understandable because of superstition. We also see the use of simile as well. The narrator uses the simile, a small round table as black as ebony, to provide vivid visual imagery of the table around which the characters assembled. So picture a round table, right? And then picture 5 characters around it. And later on, we are going to be told that the vase is brought, and then the cups are also filled by Dr. Heidegger, which he dishes out to his friends. Now, we're also told about the way, it's very important, the way that the characters look, or their appearance, the way they look. We are told that they have ashen visages, right? Ashen visages. Not only that, we're also told that the personification, also the use of personification as well. The sunshine came through the window. So the sunshine came through the window as personification, which suggests that the personified sunshine also attended the meeting. The narrator also uses vivid language to strikingly recreate Dr. Heidegger's study. His description also allows the reader to see the ashen, like gray faces and visages of the elderly participants. So when he talks about the visages, he's just talking about the faces of the elderly participants. They look ashen, so almost like they're almost dead, as it were. Then one of the key things we also see again in the narration is the use of dialogue. And this is important as part of maybe you're given a question to answer on this short story or any other short story. If you're maybe writing on scene as well, dialogue is very useful because dialogue allows the reader to hear directly from the characters. Their exact words, their tone, their emotion, the inflection in their voice, all of those things we get from the dialogue. So Dr. Heidegger is presented. Now we see that the characters begin to dialogue. So he speaks and says, "My dear old friends," repeated Dr. Heidegger, "may I reckon on your aid in performing an exceedingly curious experiment." Now after this, we see that the narrator infuses himself in the narration. And we see this because of his use of the first person point of view. So he injects himself into the story here, speaking with a first person narrative voice. And this is what he says. He says, "Some of these fables, to my shame, be it spoken, might possibly be traced back to my own voracious self. And if any passages of the present tale should startle the reader's faith, I must be content to bear the stigma of a fiction monger." So you see the use of my, mine, and I, all first person pronouns. Here, the narrative voice is infused himself into the narration, almost as if he wants us to understand that his reputation he's tying his reputation to the story to say it's a true story. So the narrator injects himself into the story here, speaking with a first person narrative voice. He reveals that his decision to share the story shows that he is willing to bear the stigma of being regarded a fiction monger. His words foreshadow that aspects of the story will seem made up and appear to be too good to be true to the reader. His use of fables reiterates this point. The protagonist is also shown to be someone that is fond of performing experiments. So here Dr. Heidegger is broadened. His character is broadened. The reader is given more information on him. And how is this shown? We are told that the revelation that Dr. Heidegger would murder a mouse in an air pump and engage in the examination of a cobweb by the microscope highlights his eccentric nature and his love for fantastical acts. The narrator's use of some similar nonsense in his description of Dr. Heidegger's actions reveal that he thinks that they are ridiculous and somewhat childish, while constantly in the habit of pestering his intimates, there is another word for friends, reveals that that's Dr. Heidegger, is always bothering his friends by making them partakers of his experiments. So this is a character that loves engaging in experiments. And here, he wants to, as it were, bring like the highest form of experiment. And we're going to see the attitude of his friends towards the experiment when he relays it to them. They are quite dismissive of it. But then later on, they run amok. We see the use of visual imagery as well. The use of hobbled. So Dr. Heidegger hobbled across the chamber and returned with the same ponderous folio, bound in black leather, with common report affirmed to it to be a book of magic. Undoing the silver clasps, he opened the volume and took from among its black leather pages a rose, or what was once a rose, though now the green leaves and crimson petals has assumed one brownish hue, and the ancient flower seemed ready to crumble to dust in the doctor's hand. So we see the use of visual imagery. So the use of the word hobbled to describe Dr. Heidegger's manner of walking suggests that he walked like someone in pain. Remember, these are elderly characters, quite old. I suspect between 80-something to 90. Also, as the paragraph continues, the narrator provides the reader a detailed description of how Dr. Heidegger methodically and carefully collected and opened the ponderous folio. And the rose, right? The description creates suspense. Around this point, the reader is wondering what's happening here, what's about to happen as the experiment begun. Dr. Heidegger uses withered and crumbled flower, right? Uses the withered and crumbled flower, which he has had for 50 years. So he brings the book, and then in the book, he brings out this withered flower that has been there for 55 years. That's a long time, more than half of a century. to dramatize the life-giving power of the water from the fountain of youth. Additionally, the use of flashback by Dr. Heidegger as he recounts the circumstance under which he got the flower and its sentimental value to him reveals the history of the rose and his dead fiance's full name, Sylvia Ward. So Dr. Heidegger tells the reader that this rose, remember, we see the use of dialogue. So not only descriptive narration from Hawthorne, but we see that the characters are given a voice to speak. And when Dr. Heidegger speaks, he says, this rose, with a sigh, this same withered and crumbling flower blossomed 55 years ago. It was given to me by Sylvia Ward, whose portrait hangs yonder. So we see the mystery of the standout features of his study, like I mentioned earlier on, is the portrait of his now dead fiancée. So whose portrait hangs yonder, and I meant to wear it on my bosom at our wedding. 55 years. It has been treasured between the leaves of this old volume. So we see that the word 55 is repeated twice. So it is very, very important to the length of time that has elapsed. Now, would you deem it possible that this rose of half a century could ever bloom again? So that's like it's like something like a trial of sorts to check what his intimates or friends are thinking about. Nonsense! And the widow Witchily. So she speaks out. One of the things we are going to see that she's rather vocal. With a peevish toss of her head. You might as well ask whether an old woman's wrinkled face could ever bloom again. So one of the things I see when I read this is that only Widow Witchily spoke up. She disputed Dr. Heidegger's claim by saying that she believes in the potency of the water that's the only way she's going to believe. If an old woman's wrinkled face could ever bloom again. Her response shows that although she was speaking about herself in third person, she was longing for her youthful days again. So now she's old, and then the only way I can say it works is if my youth can be restored. Her use of bloom to characterize youthfulness shows that she considers this as a time of revitalization and the best time of life. Hello, learner. I hope you've enjoyed the lesson so far. This is a sample analysis of this short story. To purchase the full analysis of this short story or the entire 10 short stories in your collection, visit mrquakerteaches.com. There you have access to the passage-based questions and also general questions and elements of literature in each of the short stories. See the purchase links in the description below. See you in class.